In February of 1912, Arizona finally became a state. And within a few short years, something strange happened to the land beneath it. Across the high desert that surrounds the Grand Canyon, the federal government began quietly pulling coal claims out of private hands and locking them away. Claims that had been filed, worked, and fought over for years were frozen. Prospectors who believed they owned the ground under their feet learned that they owned almost nothing at all. The official reason was conservation. Protect the canyon. Preserve the wonder. Keep the greedy miners away from one of the most beautiful places on Earth. It's a clean story, and it's the one you'll find in most textbooks. But when you follow the money, the timing, and the men who actually made these decisions, that story starts to come apart in your hands. Because the withdrawal of those coal claims had almost nothing to do with saving a view. It had everything to do with who was going to control the single most valuable thing in I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. America at that moment. Energy. This is the real reason America locked up the Grand Canyon's coal. And it's a story about power, not about postcards. Let's start with the version you already know, because you have to understand the myth before you can see what it was built to hide. In the popular imagination, the Grand Canyon was saved by a handful of visionaries who looked at that impossible hole in the desert and decided it was too sacred to sell. Theodore Roosevelt stood on the South Rim in 1903 and told the crowd to leave it as it was, that the ages had been at work on it and man could only mar it. It's a beautiful line. People still quote it 100 years later. In 1906, Congress passed the Antiquities Act, which gave the president the power to set aside land by executive order. 2 years after that, in 1908, Roosevelt used that power to declare the Grand Canyon a national monument. On paper, it looked like pure preservation. A president who loved the wild places putting his own signature between the canyon and the men who wanted to dig it up. And that's where the textbook version stops. The hero saves the canyon. The miners are chased off. The wonder is protected forever. Roll the credits. But here's the first crack in the story. Roosevelt didn't just protect scenery. In those same years, he was pulling back an amount of land that had nothing to do with beauty and everything to do with fuel. Between 1906 and 1907, the Roosevelt administration withdrew roughly 66 million acres of public land from private claim. Not because those acres were pretty, because they sat on top of coal. 66 million acres. That's a piece of the country larger than most European nations taken off the table in the span of a couple of years. And almost none of it had a scenic view worth protecting. So ask yourself the obvious question. If this was about conservation, about saving landscapes, why was the government moving so aggressively on ordinary, ugly, coal-bearing ground that no tourist would ever visit? The answer is that the word conservation was doing a lot of quiet work. It sounded like protecting nature. What it often meant was the federal government deciding who got to own the country's energy and making sure the answer was not a handful of private railroad barons, because that's what coal was in 1912. Coal was not a rock. Coal was the lifeblood of the entire industrial world. Every train that crossed the continent ran on it. Every factory, every steel mill, every power plant, every warship in the growing American fleet burned it by the ton. Whoever controlled the coal controlled the pace of the whole economy. And the men in Washington understood that better than anyone. And they were, frankly, worried. In the first decade of the 20th century, there was a real fear inside the government that America was burning through its coal faster than anyone had planned for. Reports circulated in Washington warning that the country's known reserves were being handed to private companies for pennies, locked up by speculators and squandered by railroads that had been given enormous land grants decades earlier. To the planners of the Roosevelt and Taft years, coal was not just a commodity, it was national security. A country that lost control of its coal could lose control of its factories, its railroads, and its navy in a single generation. So when these men talked about protecting resources, they weren't picturing wildflowers, they were picturing a fleet with no fuel and an industry that had quietly sold its own future to a dozen private men. Now bring that back to the Grand Canyon. The canyon itself was never really the prize. The prize was the plateau around it, the coal fields of northern Arizona, and the question of who would own them at the exact moment a brand new state was being born. Here's the timing that nobody teaches you. Arizona did not become a state until February 14th, 1912. Before that, it was a territory, which meant Washington held almost total control over its land. But statehood changes everything. A state has its own legislature, its own claims, its own hunger for the resources inside its borders. The moment Arizona became a state, there was going to be a fight over who owned what was under the ground, and the federal government moved first. By locking up the coal claims before the new state could organize itself, before local interests could consolidate, Washington made sure that the most valuable mineral rights in the region stayed in federal hands. Not the state's hands, not private hands, federal hands. The conservation was the language on the paperwork. Control was the motive underneath it. There's a layer to the statehood angle that makes the timing even sharper. When a territory becomes a state, the federal government hands it certain lands, often called school lands, meant to help fund public education. But the value of those lands depends entirely on what sites under them. A section of worthless desert is one thing. A section sitting on a coal seam is a fortune. So the exact status of the minerals under Arizona's ground was not an abstract question in 1912. It was a fight over real money, over whether the new state would inherit rich land or empty land, and over whether Washington would keep the richest pieces for itself before the handover was even finished. Freeze the coal claims, reserve the mineral rights, and you decide the outcome of that fight before the new state can seat its first legislature. That is not conservation. That is a land grab with a halo painted over it. This is what revisionist economic history actually looks like when you strip away the romance. You stop asking who loved the canyon, and you start asking who profited from the rules and who was cut out of them. And when you ask those questions about 1912, a very different picture comes into focus. This is the part where some people get uncomfortable, and I understand why. It can feel cynical to suggest that a beloved national treasure was protected for money and power rather than for beauty. But cynicism is not the same thing as accuracy. Following the money is not a dark art. It is simply refusing to accept the flattering version of events until the numbers actually back it up. And in 1912, the numbers do not point to a nation of pure dreamers protecting a canyon out of love. They point to a government, a set of powerful railroads, and a handful of sharp operators, all circling the same prize, all reaching for the same fuel, and all perfectly content to let the public believe the story was about scenery. When the pretty explanation and the profitable explanation line up this neatly, the honest question is which one was really doing the steering. Here, it was the profit. The beauty just came along for the ride. To understand how tangled this really was, look at who already owned the canyon's front door. The Santa Fe Railway had reached the South Rim in 1901, and by 1905 it had built the El Tovar, a grand hotel perched right on the edge of the abyss. The railroad didn't just carry tourists to the canyon, it housed them, fed them, guided them, and sold them the entire experience. It had poured a fortune into turning a remote gorge into a destination, and it fully intended to profit from every part of it, the view and the fuel alike. The same railroads that ran the tourist trade also ran on coal, and they had spent decades acquiring rights to the very deposits now being pulled back into federal hands. So when you hear that the government was protecting the canyon from private greed, remember that the single biggest private interest in the region was a railroad that wanted both the tourists on top and the coal underneath. The struggle over the plateau was never a tidy contest between a noble government and a few grubby miners. It was a three-way fight between Washington, the railroads, and independent operators, and the public was handed a two-character fairy tale about it. To really see it, you have to meet the man the government spent years trying to destroy. His name was Ralph Cameron. Cameron was a prospector who came to the canyon in the 1880s, and he understood something that the dreamers never did. He understood that in the Grand Canyon the real money was not in the rock, it was in the road. In the 1890s, Cameron and his partners built and controlled the Bright Angel Trail, the main path down into the canyon. And then he did something clever and ruthless. He filed a string of mining claims all along that trail. Officially, they were claims to dig for copper and other minerals. In reality, most of them were what people at the time called sham claims. He wasn't seriously mining them. He was using the mining laws as a legal weapon to control the land, the trail, and the flow of tourists. Because whoever held those claims controlled who could pass. And Cameron charged a toll, $1 a head, to walk down into the canyon on the main trail. Every tourist, every mule, every dreamer who wanted to see the bottom of the world had to pay Ralph Cameron for the privilege. Now stop and notice what that tells you. A man used the mining claim system, the exact same system the government was busy shutting down, not to pull minerals out of the earth, but to control access and extract money from a strategic piece of ground. The claims were never really about the coal or the copper. They were about who holds the gate. And that is the key that unlocks the whole story. Because if Ralph Cameron figured out that mining claims were really about control, then the men in Washington had figured it out too, on a much larger scale. The government fought Cameron for the better part of 2 decades. They challenged his claims in court. They sent surveyors and investigators to prove the claims were fraudulent, that he wasn't doing real mining, that he was just squatting on valuable ground and taxing everyone who walked by. Case after case climbed through the legal system, and the fight went all the way up to the highest courts in the land. If this was really about conservation, about protecting a beautiful place from destruction, that fight makes no sense. Cameron wasn't blowing up the canyon. He wasn't strip mining the rim. He was collecting tolls and holding paper. What the government could not tolerate was not the damage, it was the control. A private citizen had gotten his hands on the gate, and Washington wanted that gate for itself. And here is the detail that should make you laugh, or maybe wince. The government eventually won its war against Ralph Cameron. His claims were stripped away, his toll booth shut down, his grip on the trail finally broken. But Cameron did not vanish into history as a beaten man. In 1920, the people of Arizona elected him to the United States Senate. The very man who had spent decades fighting the federal government over control of the canyon walked straight into that government and took a seat at the table. Once he was there, he turned his power against the National Park Service and the agencies that had beaten him, trying to reopen on the Senate floor the fights he had lost in the dirt. It is a near-perfect parable for this whole story. The battle over the Grand Canyon was never really good against evil. It was a fight over a chair. Whoever sat in it controlled the land, and the men who lost the chair simply kept trying to climb back into it by another route. And it is worth remembering that real people got run over by all of this. The prospectors who lost their claims were not cartoon villains twirling a moustache over a dynamite plunger. Many of them were working men who had spent years and their entire savings filing paperwork, hauling equipment into brutal country, and betting their lives on a strike that might never come. When the withdrawals came down, their claims could be voided, their permits denied, their years of labour erased by a decision made in an office 2,000 miles away. Some of them fought it in court and lost. Some just walked away broke. The friendly word for what happened to them was conservation. The honest word was much closer to seizure. History remembers the beautiful canyon that was saved. It quietly forgets the men who were cleared off the land so that a larger and more powerful interest could take their place. So the campaign against Cameron and the withdrawal of the coal claims were not two separate stories. They were the same story. Both were about one thing: taking control of the land and its resources out of private hands and putting it firmly under federal power. Conservation was simply the friendliest word available to describe an act of pure economic strategy. None of this happened by accident, and none of it happened through the parks alone. In 1910, Congress passed something called the Pickett Act, which gave the President explicit legal power to withdraw public lands from private claim and hold them in reserve. It was the machinery that made the coal lockups airtight. Roosevelt had started pulling coal land off the market years earlier, sometimes on shaky legal footing, and his successor, William Howard Taft, inherited both the strategy and the controversy that came with it. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. The Pickett Act cleaned up the legal questions and handed the executive branch a dependable tool for freezing land whenever it chose. Notice what that tool was actually built to do. It was not written to protect a beautiful view. It was written to let Washington reach out and pull any valuable piece of the public domain into federal control with the stroke of a pen. Conservation groups praised it, mining interests hated it, and coal, always coal, sat right at the center of the fight. And 1912 was the hinge. That was the era when the world's navies were beginning to argue over coal versus oil, when the automobile was turning from a rich man's toy into an industry, when the demand for cheap and reliable energy was about to explode across the entire country. Whoever locked down the great western coalfields in that exact window would hold quiet leverage over the next 50 years of American growth. The people making these decisions understood that perfectly, which is why the timing was never a coincidence. It was the entire point. And here is where the story gets stranger, because this is the point where the alternative history community stops trusting the official record entirely. This is where the Grand Canyon stops being just an economic mystery and starts being something else. Because there is a second story about the Grand Canyon from this exact era, a story that most historians dismiss out of hand, and that a certain kind of researcher has never been able to let go of. On April 5th, 1909, a newspaper called the Arizona Gazette published a front-page article with an astonishing claim. It reported that an explorer, a man the paper called G.E. Kincaid, working under the direction of the Smithsonian Institution, had discovered an enormous underground citadel carved into the rock of the Grand Canyon. The article described long tunnels, chambers cut with careful geometry, statues that looked Egyptian or Asian, hieroglyphic writing on the walls, and rooms that could have housed thousands of people. According to the article, this was not a natural cave. It was a built structure, an ancient advanced engineered complex hidden inside the American desert, evidence of a lost civilization that did not fit anywhere in the accepted history of North America. That's the claim. And I want to be honest with you about it, because honesty is the whole point of doing this kind of history well. The Smithsonian has stated that it has no record of a G.E. Kincaid, no record of the expedition, and no record of the cavern. The names in the article cannot be verified. No follow-up was ever published. No artifacts were ever produced. Most serious historians regard the article as a hoax, one of many sensational stories that frontier newspapers ran in that era to sell copies. By the standard of evidence, the Kincaid Cavern is not proven. It probably never existed. It helps to understand the world that produced that article. The early 20th century was a golden age of the newspaper hoax. Papers competed for readers with wild, unverifiable front-page stories, and a tale about a lost Egyptian city buried under the American desert was exactly the kind of thing that could sell out an entire print run. This was the same country that had already been fooled by the Cardiff Giant, a fake stone man buried in the ground and dug up to amaze the paying public. Sensational archaeology was entertainment, so the most likely explanation for the Kincaid story is also the most boring one. A reporter or an editor or a clever con man spun a thrilling yarn, the paper printed it, it moved copies, and when no evidence ever surfaced, everyone simply moved on. That is almost certainly what happened, and I am not going to pretend otherwise just to keep you excited. So why does it matter? Why bring it up at all? It matters because of the questions it forces you to ask, and because those questions rhyme uncomfortably with the economic story we've been tracing. The Tartaria idea at its core is a suspicion. It's the suspicion that the history we've been handed is missing something, that there was more in the ground, more in the old records, more in the architecture of the world than the official account admits. Most of that suspicion is built on misreadings and wishful thinking, but underneath the wilder claims sits a real and reasonable instinct, which is that powerful institutions have always decided what the public gets to know about the land, its past, and its wealth. And that instinct is not crazy, because we just watched it happen with the coal. Think about what the withdrawal actually did. It took huge areas of the plateau, marked them off, and put them under federal authority. It restricted who could enter, who could file claims, who could dig, and who could even survey. In the name of protecting a canyon, the government created zones of the American West where ordinary people simply could not go and could not look too closely at what was under the surface. The alternative historians look at that and ask a blunt question. If you wanted to keep people away from something in the ground, whatever it was, is there a better cover story in all of American history than conservation, than protecting a national wonder? You don't have to send soldiers. You don't have to admit anything. You simply declare the land sacred, draw a line around it, and anyone who trespasses is not a threat to a secret. He's just a vandal threatening a beautiful place. The public will cheer you for keeping him out. I don't tell you that to convince you that giants and pharaohs are buried in the canyon walls. The evidence for that is not there. I tell you it because the mechanism is real, even if the treasure is imaginary. The tool of using preservation as a form of control is not a fantasy. It's documented. We can trace it through the coal withdrawals and the war against Cameron without ever leaving the world of hard, boring fact. And that's the strange irony at the centre of this whole thing. The Tartaria crowd is chasing a spectacular secret that almost certainly isn't there. But in chasing it, they stumbled onto a real one, that is. The Grand Canyon really was locked up. The public really was kept out. The reason really was hidden behind a friendlier word. They just guessed wrong about what the hidden thing was. It wasn't a lost empire. It was coal and the power that comes with owning it. So let's put the pieces back together and look at the machine as a whole, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Start with the resource. By 1912, coal was the foundation of industrial power, and the coal fields of the American West were some of the last great unclaimed deposits in the country. Whoever locked them down early would shape the balance of economic power for generations. Add the timing. Arizona became a state that same year, which meant the window to decide who owned those minerals, the federal government or the new state or private interests, was closing fast. Washington had to act before the new state could assert its own claims. Add the players. The railroads, especially the Santa Fe, had enormous interests around the canyon. They ran the tourist trade, they wanted the coal to fuel their trains, and they had spent decades entangled with the land. Private operators like Ralph Cameron had shown exactly how a clever man could seize control of strategic ground using nothing but mining paperwork. Washington had watched all of it. Now add the tool, the Antiquities Act, the coal land withdrawals, the national monument status, the endless court fights over claims. Every one of these was described to the public as protection. Every one of them, in practice, transferred control of land and resources away from private hands and into federal ones. And finally, add the language. Conservation. A word so warm and so unarguable that no one would ever demand to see the ledger behind it. Who's going to stand up and argue against saving the Grand Canyon? Nobody. That's exactly why it was the perfect cover. Not for aliens, not for ancient Egyptians, for something far more ordinary and far more valuable. Federal control of the nation's energy at the precise moment it mattered most. When you line all of that up, the conservation story doesn't just look incomplete. It looks like a carefully chosen surface, a public face bolted onto a private calculation. The canyon was the beautiful thing everyone was told to look at. The coal was the valuable thing they were quietly steered away from. And this is the pattern that revisionist economic history keeps uncovering over and over in different places and different decades. The story we're handed is almost always the emotional one, the heroic one, the one with a clear villain and a noble saviour. The story underneath is almost always about ownership, about who ends up holding the deed when the music stops. And the Grand Canyon was not unique. This same move, this quiet swap of a noble reason for a strategic one, played out all across the American West in those years. Forests were reserved, mineral lands were withdrawn, monuments were declared, and in case after case the public story was preservation, while the private reality was control of timber, water, coal, and oil. The West we picture as wild and lovingly protected is, in large part, a map of decisions about who would own its wealth, made in a narrow window of years and sold to the public wrapped in the language of love for the land. The canyon is simply the most beautiful example, which is exactly why it made the best cover. And once a story like that sets, it hardens fast. Within a single generation, the conservation version was not just the official account. It was the only account. The children of the men who lost their claims grew up learning that the canyon had been heroically saved from greed, never suspecting that their own fathers had been standing on the wrong side of that heroic line. The economic manoeuvring faded from memory because it was never interesting enough to teach. Nobody prints an inspiring classroom poster about mineral rights and executive land withdrawals. But a president on a canyon rim telling a nation to protect its natural wonders that becomes a legend. The dull truth got buried under the beautiful one, and not through some grand conspiracy in a smoke-filled room. It happened through the simple fact that a good story always beats an accurate one. That doesn't mean every conservation effort was a con. Plenty of people who fought for the canyon loved it sincerely, and the land really was worth protecting. Two things can be true at once. A place can be genuinely worth saving, and the act of saving it can also be the most convenient way ever devised to seize control of what lies beneath it. The genius of the whole arrangement is that the sincere protectors gave perfect cover to the strategic planners. The idealists made the operators look like saints, so the next time you see that famous photograph of the president on the rim telling the country to leave the canyon as it is, hold two thoughts in your head at the same time. Yes, he may have meant it, and also in those very same years his administration was locking away tens of millions of acres of coal that no tourist would ever admire, quietly rewriting who owned the fuel of the future. The mining claims were never really about the minerals. Ralph Cameron proved that with his toll booth. The withdrawals were never really about the scenery. The coalfields proved that with their sheer, ugly, unscenic size. And the conservation story was never the whole story. It was the part they were comfortable telling. As for the cavern, the tunnels, the statues in the rock, the evidence isn't there, and an honest look says it was almost certainly a newspaper's invention from a hungry, sensational age. But the reason that story refuses to die is worth sitting with. It survives because people can feel, even when they can't prove it, that they've been kept out of something, that a line was drawn across the land and a friendly reason was given for it, and that the friendly reason was not the true one. In the case of the Grand Canyon coal, they were right about the feeling, even if they were wrong about the treasure. The land was locked, the public was kept back. The true reason was buried under a better sounding one. It just wasn't a lost civilization down there in the dark. It was the thing that runs every empire, ancient or modern. It was who gets to own the source of power and who never even gets to see the door. That's the real reason America withdrew the Grand Canyon coal claims, not to save a view, to win a quiet war over the fuel of a century, fought with paperwork instead of guns, and dressed up in a word that no one would ever think to question. And once you've seen that move, that trick of hiding a ledger behind a landscape, you start to notice it everywhere. In other parks, in other withdrawals, in other beautiful, protected, off-limits places, where the official reason is always so pure that asking a second question feels almost rude. Maybe that's the real elixir buried in this story. Not gold, not giants, not a secret empire under the desert. Just a habit of mind, the habit of looking past the beautiful thing you're told to admire and asking calmly and without fear, what exactly is being kept on the other side of that line, and who decided you weren't allowed to see it? The canyon will always be worth the trip, but the story they wrapped around it is worth a far, far closer look than most.